Not every pilot who flies into combat comes back the same. Some don't come back at all. My name is Lieutenant David Morgan, and what I'm about to tell you is not a story about victory. It's a story about what it costs to win, and what it feels like to watch men die on both sides of a war you didn't start, but had to finish. I was 29 years old when the Falklands War began. I had trained for years for a conflict I never believed would actually happen. The Royal Navy was my world. The flight deck, the briefings, the constant drilling that turns fear into procedure. But nothing, not one exercise, not one simulation, not one instructor, prepares you for the moment when the war stops being a concept and becomes a sound. A specific sound. The sound of a missile leaving a rail and disappearing into the gray South Atlantic sky. When Argentina seized the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982, I was aboard HMS Hermes. The news reached us the way bad news always does in the military, quickly, flatly, without drama. The islands had been taken. We were going south. That was it. No speeches, no long explanations. Just the quiet understanding that the next few weeks would define everything. The journey south took weeks. The South Atlantic is not a friendly ocean. It doesn't care about your training, your aircraft, or your mission. It simply exists. Cold, vast, indifferent. Standing on the flight deck at night, watching the water disappear into darkness, I thought about the men on the other side. Argentine pilots. I had read the intelligence reports. I knew they were good. I knew they were brave. I also knew that in the air, bravery alone doesn't keep you alive. Skill does. And we were about to find out whose skill was sharper. The Sea Harrier was our aircraft. To anyone outside the military world, it looked almost modest. A small jet, vertical takeoff capability, designed for naval operations. But inside that aircraft, sitting in that cockpit, with the engine running and the deck moving beneath you, it felt like the most powerful thing in the world. It was fast, it was agile, and it carried missiles that could reach targets before those targets even knew we were there. The Sidewinder, AIM-9L. That missile would prove to be one of the defining weapons of this conflict. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the fighting began, there was the waiting. And in my experience, waiting is harder than combat. In combat, the body takes over. The training kicks in. You react. But in the waiting, you think. And thinking, when you're heading toward a war zone, is a dangerous occupation. I thought about my family. I thought about the briefings we had received about Argentine air capability, their Skyhawks, their Mirages, their Super Etendars armed with Exocet missiles. That last one concerned everyone on the task force. The Exocet was a sea-skimming missile, radar-guided, fast, and almost impossible to stop once it had locked onto a target. We had seen what one had done to HMS Sheffield. That changed everything. Sheffield. I need to talk about Sheffield. May 4th, 1982. A Type 42 destroyer. 20 men killed, 26 wounded. The ship eventually sank. When that news came through, the atmosphere on Hermes shifted in a way that I still struggle to describe. It wasn't panic. We were trained not to panic. It wasn't even pure fear, though fear was certainly present. It was the arrival of reality. Until Sheffield, some part of every man on the task force had still believed this might somehow resolve itself without catastrophic loss. Sheffield ended that belief. The war had teeth, and those teeth could reach us. My first combat patrol came shortly after. We launched from Hermes in pairs, climbing into skies that were almost never clear. Low cloud, mist, the kind of visibility that makes everything feel closer and more dangerous than it actually is. The Argentine mainland was not far enough away. Their aircraft had range. We knew they were coming. We just didn't know when or from which direction. The first time I saw an Argentine aircraft in the air, it was a fraction of a second of recognition before everything became instinct. I had practiced this moment thousands of times in simulation. But simulation doesn't give you the smell of the cockpit when your heart rate doubles, or the strange clarity that comes over you when the situation becomes completely real, and there is simply no room for anything except the next correct action. We engaged. I won't go into the specific details of every engagement, not because they are classified, but because combat at that speed and altitude compresses time in a way that makes sequence difficult to explain. What I can tell you is this. The Argentine pilots I faced were not amateurs. They were professionals who flew with extraordinary courage in aircraft that were, in several respects, at a disadvantage against ours. The Sidewinder AIM-9L gave us a capability they could not match, the ability to fire from almost any angle, not just from behind. That was a significant advantage. But advantage is not the same as safety. Nothing about those engagements was safe. There is something that happens in your mind after you fire a missile and watch it find its target. I will be honest about this because I think it matters. There is no celebration in the moment itself. There is a kind of hollow confirmation. It worked, the target is gone. And then immediately, the scan continues, because in that environment, there is never just one threat. The emotion, whatever it is, comes later. Sometimes much later. Sometimes not, in the way you expect. I thought about the pilot on the other side. I still do. He was doing exactly what I was doing, following his training, executing his mission, trying to stay alive. The fact that we were enemies was a political reality, not a human one. The sky doesn't care about the politics below it. Up there, it was simply two men in machines, and one of us had a technological edge that day. That is not glory. It is just the arithmetic of war. The air war over the Falklands was fought mostly at low level and at high speed. The Argentine pilots had developed a tactic that was genuinely dangerous. They would come in extremely low, almost touching the wavetops to avoid radar detection. It was the same logic we used ourselves. Stay low, stay fast, stay invisible for as long as possible. When they pulled up to attack, the window of exposure was minimal. You had seconds to react, seconds to respond. In those seconds, everything you had learned either worked or it didn't. There was a day that I think about more than others. I won't say the exact date because some of what surrounded it remains sensitive even now. What I will tell you is that we were airborne, and we received word that Argentine aircraft were inbound to the amphibious landing zone at San Carlos water. San Carlos was everything. It was where our land forces were going ashore. If the Argentine Air Force could get through to those ships, the transports, the landing ships, the support vessels, the entire ground campaign could be compromised. We turned towards San Carlos. I remember the cloud base that day, lower than I would have liked, which compressed the airspace and made everything more intense, more immediate. When the Argentine aircraft appeared, they were exactly where we expected them and exactly as good as we had been told. They came in low, fast, committed. These were not pilots who lacked courage. Whatever else one might say about that conflict, I will never say that. We engaged. The next several minutes were the most concentrated of my flying career. I was aware of everything and nothing simultaneously. The aircraft's behavior, the radar picture, the position of my wingman, the trajectory of the threats. Time did not slow down the way people sometimes say it does. If anything, it accelerated. Everything happened faster than thought, which is exactly why the training matters. You don't think your way through a combat engagement at 600 knots. You have already thought through it. In the years before, in the simulations, in the briefings. By the time the moment arrives, the thinking is done. What's left is execution. When it was over and we were climbing back toward Hermes, I took a breath that felt like the first one in several minutes. My hands were steady. That surprised me the first time and continued to surprise me. The body is remarkable under extreme stress. It performs. It is the mind that has to catch up afterward. Back on deck, the debrief. Always the debrief. In the military, you learn more from what went wrong than from what went right, so you go through everything. Position, timing, weapons employment, communications. You extract every lesson, because next time, those lessons might be the difference between coming home and not coming home. Not everyone came home. I need to say that clearly. The Falklands War cost British lives, 255 of them. Each one of those was a person with a family, a history, a future that was ended. I knew some of them. I had flown with some of them, eaten with some of them, laughed with some of them in the way that people who face danger together learn to laugh. Not because things are funny, but because laughter is one of the ways human beings manage the weight of what they are doing. When HMS Coventry was sunk on May 25th, 19 men died. I remember hearing that. I remember the specific quality of the silence that followed the announcement. Coventry was a Type 42 destroyer like Sheffield, a ship we all knew, with people on it we either knew personally or knew by reputation. When you lose a ship, you lose a community. The sea takes everything at once. And then there was Atlantic Conveyor. May 25th was a terrible day. The Exocet that was meant for one of the carriers struck the container ship instead. 12 men lost. And with the ship went vital helicopters, Chinooks that we desperately needed for the ground campaign. The loss of those helicopters meant that thousands of British soldiers had to march across the Falkland Islands on foot in conditions that were brutal, even by the standards of a war. Freezing temperatures, boggy ground, equipment that seemed designed to maximize physical suffering. Those men carried what they had on their backs and walked toward the enemy. I have enormous respect for what they endured. From the air, I occasionally flew close air support missions that gave me a perspective on the ground war. What I saw made me grateful to be a pilot. The landscape of the Falklands is not hospitable. It is beautiful in a stark, austere way. Wide open, treeless, the kind of terrain that offers no comfort and no shelter. The Argentine positions were well constructed in many cases, dug into the high ground around Stanley. The British infantry had to attack uphill, at night, across open ground against prepared defenses. The battles at Mount Longdon, Wireless Ridge, Mount Tumbledown, these were not clean, distant engagements. These were close, brutal, personal fights where men grappled with each other in the dark, and the outcome was decided by will as much as by weapons. I want to say something about the Argentine soldiers specifically, because I think history sometimes does them a disservice. Many of them were young conscripts, boys, really, 18 or 19 years old, sent to fight in conditions they had not been fully prepared for, in a climate that was genuinely dangerous even without bullets. They were cold. Many of them were poorly supplied, and their command structure failed them in ways that were not their fault. And yet many of them fought with determination and courage that any soldier would respect. The war was not a simple story of competence versus incompetence. It was a story of two sides doing their best under impossible conditions, with the British holding certain structural advantages, better logistics, better air support, better command and control, that ultimately proved decisive. June 14th, 1982. Argentina surrendered. I was airborne when the news came through. I remember the exact moment, the voice on the radio, the words, the brief silence that followed. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something more like relief, so profound it was almost physical. A loosening of something that had been held tight for weeks. It was over. People would stop dying. That felt like enough. Landing back on Hermes that day was different from every other landing. The deck crew were there, the same people who had been there every day, who had worked in wind and rain and danger to keep our aircraft serviceable and ready. There was something in the air that was not quite celebration and not quite solemnity. It was a kind of collective exhale. We had done what we were sent to do. The islands were back, and most of us were still alive. But I want to be careful about how I frame that, because victory, in a military sense, is not the same as a clean resolution. The Falklands War left scars that did not disappear when the fighting stopped. British veterans came home to a country that was proud, but also, in many cases, unprepared to actually talk about what those veterans had experienced. Post-traumatic stress was not widely understood then. Men who had seen terrible things were expected to simply resume normal life, and many of them found that enormously difficult. I was one of the fortunate ones. I had support. I had the ability to process what I had been through. Not everyone did. And the Argentine veterans, they came home to a different kind of silence, to a country that had been told they were winning right up until the surrender, to a military government that would collapse within months of the defeat, to a grief that had no official acknowledgement and no proper memorial for many years. Those men suffered in ways that I think about, even now. The young conscripts especially. They were sent by a government that did not deserve their sacrifice into a war that could have been avoided, and many of them paid a price that was not theirs to pay. War, I have come to believe, is not something that ends when the guns go quiet. It continues in the people who were there, in the memories that surface unexpectedly, in the faces that appear in dreams, in the questions that have no satisfying answers. Why did it have to come to this? Was there a moment when it could have been stopped? What would the world look like if different decisions had been made in those early days of April 1982? I don't have those answers. No one does. What I have is the memory of what it was actually like. The cold air at altitude, the weight of the aircraft around me, the strange intimacy of combat, the faces of the men I served with, some of whom are still here and some of whom are not. That is what I carry. That is what any veteran carries. If you ask me what the Falklands War taught me, I would say this. It taught me that human beings are capable of extraordinary things under extraordinary pressure. It taught me that the enemy is never simply the enemy. He is a person, doing what he believes he must do, in service of something he was told was worth fighting for. It taught me that the cost of war is never fully visible in the moment, only in the years that follow, when the full weight of what was lost becomes clear. I flew 26 combat missions over the Falkland Islands. I came home. Many men did not. The least I can do, the least any of us who came home can do, is to make sure that what happened there is remembered accurately, honestly, and with respect for everyone who was part of it. Not just the winners, everyone. Because in war, the arithmetic of victory and defeat obscures a simpler truth. Every life lost was a world that ended. On both sides of that cold, gray water. Every single one. If this story made you think about the human cost behind the history, subscribe. Because history is not just dates and battles. It is people. And as long as we remember the people, the history stays alive.